But before I get to that part, the first thing I'm going to say is, every time a senator runs for president, the other side knows in advance how it's going to campaign against that candidate. When John Kerry got the nomination in 2004, I knew exactly what Karl Rove was going to use against him, and that was his voting record in the Senate. Because anybody who's been in the Senate for any length of time develops a voting record. And you can be the model of philosophical consistency and still come off looking like a flip-flopper, because I knew that's what he was going to be branded as. And this simply because of the quirks of the legislative process, of the political system. So that, you know, the famous series of votes that was used against Kerry in 2004 was a vote on the Iraq Appropriations Bill, where he had voted for it, and then he'd voted against it, and then he'd voted for it. So where does he stand? He was flip-flopping. Well, in fact, he wasn't flip-flopping. The bill was flip-flopping. This happens all the time. A bill is introduced, and there's an initial vote in committee or something on it, and you favor it. And then a rider or an amendment is introduced, and now the bill has changed, and it's become unacceptable. Same bill, but it has changed, so you vote against it. You haven't changed your position, but the bill has changed. And then the amendment of the rider gets removed, and then you vote for it. So you've taken the same position all along. And by the way, not everybody in the Senate takes the same position all along, but even if you're the model of consistency, it looks as though you flip-flopped. And given the attention span of politics these days, in a 15-second soundbite, you can't explain that away. So this is what your opponents use against you. This is why, if you want to run for president, and you're in the Leadership Academy, someday you might want to run for president, don't go into the Senate. Become governor. Being a governor is much better as a launching pad for a presidential career, because in the first place, the issues that you have to decide are typically not ones of such federal importance. So it's harder for your opponents to use your track record against you. And if you really want to be president, move to Texas before you become governor, because you want to be governor of a state that has a weak governor system. Because everybody knows it's a weak governor system, and anything that goes wrong you can blame on somebody else. If you're in a state that has a system of a strong governor, then you have a hard time dodging the bullet. Okay, so that's the political background. But here's the deeper part when it comes to this question of leadership. What it comes down to is this: the leadership skills required for success in the Senate, and this applies to the House as well, but the Senate is higher profile. The leadership skills required for success in the Senate are quite different from the leadership skills required for success as president. If you're going to succeed as a senator, you have to know how to go along and to get along. You have to acknowledge that there are 99 other people in this Senate, and everyone has an equal right to claim their share of the truth with you. If you are a senator, if you are a successful senator, then you have to be able to compromise your position. You have to be able to cut deals. I'll support you on this particular measure if you'll support me on that particular measure. These are the skills that make for success in the Senate. And no senator ever had more skill in this regard. No senator was ever a more effective leader than Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was majority leader of the Senate in the 1950s. And Lyndon Johnson was absolutely brilliant as a legislator. Lyndon Johnson subsequently became president. And he discovered that the skills required of a president, the leadership skills, are quite different from the skills required of a Senate majority leader. Johnson was absolutely brilliant in the role of president as legislator in chief. In fact, he was too good for his own good and for the nation's good. Johnson managed to persuade, to browbeat, to cajole, to threaten, to intimidate Congress into passing more bills faster than any administration in history. Johnson won a large victory in the 1964 election, and he got his team together and he said, okay, we've got about a year and a half. That's how much time the American people are going to give us. We're going to spend down our political capital, so we better get going. And he passed landmark legislation. He passed some very important pieces of legislation. The basis for the Medicare system, Aid to elementary and secondary education, the initial environmental regulations, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He had already passed, before his election, he had already pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. So Johnson understood how you can get bills passed. And as I say, in his role of president as legislator-in-chief, he has never been exceeded. He set as his benchmark Franklin Roosevelt's 100 days, when Roosevelt passed, and Roosevelt and Congress passed, 15 major pieces of legislation within the first 3 months of the Roosevelt administration. And Johnson decided he was going to do better than that. Johnson had always modeled himself on Franklin Roosevelt, and Johnson was going to surpass that, and he did. Now, some of these pieces of legislation were poorly written. Some of them had consequences that no one had any idea of. One of the best examples is the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. It was a piece of legislation that seemed to be, at the time, just a minor tweaking of the immigration system. But it turned out to have enormous ramifications that we've been living with ever since. The other aspect of Johnson's presidency, where he had to be commander-in-chief, I said he was a good legislator-in-chief. As a commander-in-chief, Johnson was a disaster. And the disaster came from precisely the same skills that made him a success as legislator-in-chief. When you're legislator-in-chief, you look for the middle ground. You look for what can bring people together. But when you fight a war, if that's the attitude you take, it's almost certainly a recipe for disaster. Because you're either going to fight a war or you're not going to fight a war. But Johnson wanted to have it both ways. Johnson often said that he didn't want to escalate the war in Vietnam to the level where it distracted Congress from his domestic reform package, which to him was far more important than what was going on in Vietnam or elsewhere around the world. Most presidents, I said this morning, most presidents get elected on the basis of domestic politics. And for most presidents, domestic politics is more important than for foreign affairs. This isn't always the case. Occasionally you get someone who's the reverse. But with Johnson, the domestic arena was far more important than the foreign policy arena. And so he subordinated the interests of foreign policy to domestic policy. And he tried to fight Vietnam along the middle ground. There were those who said the United States ought to get out. This is a loser, and we simply can't win, so let's pull our troops out. There were others who said, Mr. President, you need to ask Congress to declare war. You need to mobilize, you need to declare a national emergency, and wage this as though we're really intent to win. And Johnson refused to do it, just as he did in the Senate, just as he did as legislator-in-chief. He tried to find a common ground. He tried to split the difference. And by splitting the difference, he wound up splitting the country and, in the end, losing the war in Vietnam. So the moral of this story is that if you're going to succeed in leadership in any realm, you probably ought to figure out which realm you want to specialize in. If you want to be a success in business, okay, focus on that and cultivate those talents and those skills. Or another way of putting it is recognize in yourself what talents you have and what kind of personality you have. I talked about leadership skills. Well, the skills often reflect the personality. And great presidents, I think, have what you can call an executive personality. They tend not to have a legislative personality. The legislative personality is the one where you acknowledge that other people have their portion of the truth and they have as much right to write up this bill and get this whatever measure it might be passed. The executive personality says, no, I'm making the decision. The buck stops here. In the Senate, in the House of Representatives, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. The buck just keeps going around because everybody has to sign on to it. And if you're a success in that realm, that's fine. I mean, if you've got those skills.